morning, good day, good evening, listeners. Welcome once again to our conversations on Straight Talk. Today, we're going to be talking about the race problem in our country. This has recently become a very topical issue. And it so happens that every time our country is preparing for elections, this problem or this issue surfaces. Why this is so, this is what we're going to talk about today. The race problem in Guyana cannot be isolated from the political or what is called the class problem. They're all interconnected: race, politics, and class. This problem was introduced in the colony, our country that was called British Guyana, many years ago. When the British colonized our country and administered the political, economic, and social affairs of the then British Guyana, sugar was the main industry. Of course, there were other byproducts such as rum and alcohol. These products were exported mainly to the United Kingdom. To maintain their dominance over the affairs of our country, and recognizing that at some point in time they would have to leave the shores of Guyana, like they did in many countries in Africa and India in particular, which was influencing the independence movement in many parts of the world, the British recognized that they had to leave what I would describe as an enduring legacy that was totally unhelpful to the future of our country. And this was the question of divide and rule. In our country, there are 6 races. We all have learned that in school. But the 2 predominant ethnic groups, or racial groups as we call them, would be the African Guyanese and the Indian Guyanese. We would call them the Indo-Guyanese and the Afro-Guyanese. These 2 groups of people developed in a very dominant way in our country because of the economic and social conditions that obtained in the country at the time. The colonial powers, recognizing this, found that one political party that had been established in the 1950s was very influential in the independence movement. And therefore, they found that it was necessary to split up that movement. This is how the split took place in the PPP in 1955. Mr. Barnum, who was then the chairman of the party, decided that he should be the leader of the People's Progressive Party. In fact, that is where the slogan emerged, "Leader or Nothing." Interestingly, in the course of that split, when it actually took place, the majority of Africans in the leadership of the party and in the membership of the party followed Dr. Jagan, an East Indian. Few of the Indian Guyanese, particularly 2 at the top, they followed Mr. Barnum. Why? It is important to note the answer to this question. And this is where the class factor comes in. The two main East Indian leaders that followed Mr. Barnum were rich East Indian people. And they followed Mr. Barnum because of class, not necessarily of race. Because they had the same kind of economic and political interests. So that when we hear people say that the split that took place in the PPP was dominantly or predominantly of a racial bias, it is not necessarily true. But as events eventually evolved, race became a dominant factor. The constitution was suspended, and with the suspension of the constitution, the People's Progressive Party was placed at a disadvantage because they were not allowed to function legally. The leaders were prohibited from going into certain areas, and they were restricted. Many of them were detained and were not able to travel through the length and breadth of the country. Whereas Mr. Burnham and his followers were allowed to freely move about the country. Why was this so? This is because the colonial powers had a plan for Guyana. The plan started from since then, which was to prevent the PPP from taking our country's independence. And this is precisely where the problem started. The race riots and the disturbances, Indians against Africans, Africans against Indians, a most unfortunate situation, which we hope would never ever return to our country. Only recently, the People's National Congress, which is the ruling or the dominant party in the APNU-AFC, they observed the anniversary of the bombing of a boat called, or a launch called the Sun Chapman in the Demerara River. There was a loud debate, or I should say a muted debate, on this subject. What we did not hear from those who spoke at the commemoration activity was the fact that thousands of East Indians who lived, who had properties, who had businesses in the Wisma Mackenzie area were forced to leave that area and seek their fortunes on the coast, on the East Coast, the West Coast, as refugees. And that helped to compound the problem that we are living with right now. Independence came, and as we all know, the electoral system was changed from first past the post to proportional representation. The disturbances influenced the political situation, and we were told that, or we understand from the history books, that the PPP under Jagan was not allowed to take the country to independence. The point I want to make at this point in time of our discussion is that the racial, the political, and the class problem began since then. It is not something that sprung up overnight within recent times. And it is most unfortunate that many people do not recognize that this problem started from since the colonial times. If you go back in many parts of the world where the British ruled, in India there were clashes, in Africa there were clashes. What are the issues, the tools that are used by the colonial powers? Language, tribe, religion, and race. These are the four issues that are used by colonial powers, whether they're French, Dutch, English, or whatever, to divide people in their respective countries. India was divided up, Pakistan, and then Bangladesh. Africa, there are many tribal problems still festering, for example in Kenya and many other countries that were ruled by the French, the Dutch, and the British. Guyana was no exception. So here we are at this point in time, addressing this problem. Now I should mention in passing that from time to time we would hear opponents of the PPP introducing things like, well, do you remember who it was that introduced Apanjat, not a cent more, and that blacks would be at the lowest rung of the social ladder. These are not helpful concepts to introduce in a country where you have tensions still existing between the two major ethnic groups. Upon that, still being used by some individuals to create tensions or to keep the pot boiling, so to speak, was something that in the PPP is not a pure party. It has all kinds of people in it at that time, and even up to now. But at that time, they were what is called Indian racist elements. Indian racist elements who wanted to stir up the problems and to put East Indians against East Indians, to say, vote for your own race. This is never a position that was articulated by Dr. Jagan. In addition to that, we hear them saying that in the 60s, during the disturbances, it was the PPP that introduced this idea of not a cent more. Now again, this is another concept that was taken out of context. Because when the Caldo budget was introduced, it was introduced to put more taxes on those who could afford and less on those who could not afford. And so this is where this problem of not a cent more came in. Not a cent more in taxes paid by the poor. Not a cent more for taxes paid by the poor. In other words, the PPP was not interested in the poorer class of people paying more taxes when those who could afford were not. And then the other question of blacks being at the lowest rung of the social ladder, that came as a result of a speech that was given by Dr. Jagan at a hotel in Toronto, Canada. Again, that was taken out of context. What Dr. Jagan was speaking about was blacks in America that are usually at the lowest end or rung of the social ladder. That was taken out of context and brought to Guyana to say that Jagan was talking about black people in Guyana being at the lowest rung of the social ladder, when in fact he was talking about blacks in America. So the point I'm making in this connection is that these are issues that are totally taken out of context in order to create mischief in a country where racial and ethnic problems usually are tense. Now, it doesn't mean to say that all has been lost, because over the years, the PPP has been advancing certain initiatives to address this problem. We've been talking about national unity. In order to advance the concept of national unity, we spoke about critical support. We gave critical support to the then Bonham administration in the 1974 to 76 period when they were taking progressive steps. Of course, during that time also talks, what is called inter-party talks, were taking place between the two major political parties. I was engaged in those discussions, but they didn't succeed. Later on, the PPP advanced the concept of a National Patriotic Front and a National Front government, which was to bring all the political parties together, save the Working People Alliance, who was taking the position that the Bonham government must be overthrown. We did not support the overthrow of the government. What we supported was the inclusiveness of the two major political parties in order to work towards a National Patriotic Front and a National Front government. Incidentally, I noticed in a program recently broadcast on GlobeSpan that Mr. Hamilton Green, who is one of the founders of the PNC, is now advocating the formation of a National Front government, which is very interesting. And he admitted that, unfortunately, at this last or latest stage in his life, he has come to the realization that a National Front government is what this country needs. Well, this is a matter that needs a national discussion, a national discourse, a national dialogue. Let people talk more about it. Finally, one of the other issues that PPP introduced was the question of winner does not take all. In other words, whichever political party wins the elections with a majority of votes, they should seek to include other political and social forces in the government. And that is precisely what we did with the civic. We brought in persons who were not members of the PPP. They weren't card-bearing members of the PPP, but we brought them in because they wanted to make a contribution to their country in whatever shape, form, or fashion. Now you have a lot of people in Guyana who are not members of the PPP or the PNC. They may have sympathies one way or the other, but these are individuals who are in civil society, who are prepared to step forward to contribute to the country's development. And we're seeing this playing out now in the context of the selection of a chairman for GECO. And this is a very important process which I expect and which I hope Guyanese at home and abroad are following, because this is a good example to show the struggle to find an individual who is neither PPP nor PNC, but who is independent, professional, and who has integrity, and would listen to the two sides who sit at GECOM and be able to make a decision that is not influenced by either of the two political parties. So let us follow that process very closely, because the independent chairman is very critical in a GECOM. The sharing of resources is very important as well. Who gets what? And this is where the oil, money, and the industry comes in very important. There's a big debate going on right now at home and abroad. Who will control the resources for the oil industry? And we hope that ethnicity, politics, and economics do not play the kind of role that is playing historically in determining who gets what in the oil industry and the revenues that will flow from the oil industry. The last point I want to close off with is this. Two final points. The question of democracy is always a key question for any country. If you trace the history of the PPP, you will see that it has always been raising the question of democracy, always been fighting for anything democratic is in the PPP's camp. The PNC, on the other hand, and this is not a question of cats and blame, but if you trace the history of the PNC, they've always operated in an undemocratic way. The split in the party was undemocratic. The rigging of elections is undemocratic. And all the manifestations of lack of the democratic and transparent approach that we're seeing now is coming from the history of the politics practiced by the People's National Congress. Now, recently, and this is the final point, someone asked the question, why is Guyana not like Barbados, not like Trinidad, not like Singapore? We have all these resources and yet we're still a poor country. Why is this so? Now in Barbados, you don't have an ethnic problem. Barbadians are basically mostly Afro people, African Barbadians, so to speak. They have a few whites here and there, which they would call Bacrobadians, but race is not a problem in Barbados. So let's put Barbados aside for the time being. Trinidad and Tobago is more or less like Guyana. Sugar, two basic or two major ethnic groups. And places like Singapore and Malaysia, the same problem. Chinese, Indians, ethnic Malaysians, and so forth. The answer to this problem is this. Those countries, including Barbados, even though it does not have an ethnic problem, did not experiment with their economy, did not go through political experimentations, social experimentations, and economic experiments. What do I mean by this? you recall that when Mr. Barnum and the PNC was there, they had practiced what is called cooperative socialism. And the whole country was messed up. The whole country was messed up. You do not experiment with a country's economy, with a country's politics, and with a country's social conditions, because we see the results. Those countries have moved ahead because the governments, whether they're in or out, never experimented with their countries talking about rebuilding a socialist economy or rebuilding a capitalist economy or whatever. We did that here, and we have suffered as a result of that. Now it is good that that period is behind us. And incidentally, all the political parties in Guyana agree that we should pursue a market economy, that the private sector should be the engine of growth. There's no debate on that. What is a debate over is the kind of policy that we practice in pursuance of our economic and social objectives. So I wanted to clarify this point, because when people say that we should be just as good as those other countries, it cannot have been so, because we experimented too much with our economic, social, and political conditions. And this is the reason why we lost a lot of time. Now, as a country and as a people, we have the opportunity to play catch up, so to speak. It will take time. People need to readjust. And it would seem to me that people are readjusting, but again, the race, the political, and the economic issues are playing a major role while people are adjusting. So I would like to commend this conversation to you for consideration. Think about what I've said, discuss it with your colleagues. If there are any questions that you'd like to ask, please find a way of getting those questions to me in the group called Straight Talkers Group, and we will, of course, answer those questions. Thank you very much, and it was once again a pleasure being with you on our program, Straight Talk.